The Arab slave trade lasted over 1,300 years, more than 3 times longer than the transatlantic slave trade. But why is it barely mentioned in African history?
Hi, lovelies, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, you're welcome to Building the Verse. Don't forget to please subscribe to this channel, turn on notifications so that anytime I upload a video, you will be the first person to be notified. To my returning subscribers, to those people that share my videos, leave commentaries, and also educate each and every one of us, you guys are the real MVP. Alright, lovelies, let's dive into today's video.
And where are the black Arabs today? I mean, the Arab slave trade castrated and abducted millions of Africans out of Africa to be enslaved over a period of 1,300 years. That's 13 times 100 years of systemic enslavement. And yet, it is barely talked about. You see, the Senegalese historian Tidiane Ndiaye argues that the reason that chapter remains silently erased from mainstream African history is because it is tightly protected by African elites who share the same cultural and religious belief with the Arabs who enslaved the Africans. But still, where are the black Arabs today?
Wait, Nini?
It's time to stop glamorizing Haile Selassie and learn about him and his history for what it truly is. While for many people Haile Selassie is this independent, pan-Africanist, Messiah-like figure, his history was actually marked by deep corruption and negligence. While many people did not know this, in 1943, Tigray province rose up in what is known as the Wayane Rebellion, which was partly due to the very unfair and highly disproportionate taxation and the outlawing of Tigrinya language and culture. Responded severely to this rebellion and utilized aerial bombing that led to the death of thousands of Tigrayans. Around this period, approximately 1.5 to 1.8 million Tigrayans lived in the Tigray province of Ethiopia. Additionally, upon this period, significant land confiscation, arrests, taxation increases, and administration purges occurred against Tigrayans. Education, except for religious education, was cut down significantly. Any developmental projects were taken back. Many of the local elite and clergy had their wealth confiscated. The language of Tigrinya was almost banned in professional scenarios, which was then replaced by Amharic. And for any little educational infrastructure that existed in Tigray, only 10 of which existed after the ban, Tigrayan teachers were banned, and most teachers that existed were oftentimes migrants from Central Highlands. And regional history was banned. And fast forward to 1958, when famine hit the Tigray region of Ethiopia, costing the lives of approximately 100,000 people. Haile Selassie's government ignored these reports, took deliberate steps to cover these atrocities, letting hundreds of thousands of civilians starve to death. Haile Selassie also engaged in similarly neglectful towards other regions as well, namely the Oromia region. And it's very important to remember history for what it truly is. Thank you for watching.
Transatlantic slave trade, but no one really talks about the Arab slave trade. Why is that? This is interesting to me because, the Arab slave trade actually started a long time ago, way before, around 7th century, I believe it started, and it lasted about 1,300 years, right? But we don't talk about it. And I'm pretty sure it took place across mainly North Africa, the Horn of Africa, so to speak, and parts of the Swahili coast, where the enslaved people were taken from Africa and across and sold to the Arab world, Middle East, and parts of Asia. And here's the dark part for me, right? Because many of the enslaved Africans were castrated, and even the women, they were made into concubines. And yes, that's just what people did to slaves. You will have to remember the context too. And families were rarely kept together, which is again what people just did. And it wasn't really about labor, and it was all based on domination. Yet, we barely hear about this. Maybe, just maybe, because it challenges the narrative that only Europeans were colonizers. Or maybe it's just not convenient history for us to talk about. But if we're serious about history, I think we've got to talk about all of it, not just the bits, that make people feel comfortable. We have to talk about the uncomfortable parts. And I think the Arab slave trade is so key and important to why there are so many Muslims, not just in North Africa, but in West Africa as well. Everyone talks about this.
When the descendants of defective sibling DNA start calling indigenous people uncivilized, it's projection. Because in the 1500s, their lice-infested, disease-ridden ancestors dragged over 30 deadly diseases to this continent, which killed off more than 80% of the indigenous population because they were walking biohazards who did not bathe. These are people who literally threw their feces and urine outside of their windows and watched it fester in the streets until it rained and turned their towns into diarrhea soup. Meanwhile, indigenous people in the 1500s had public sanitation, organized waste removal, clean streets they swept and washed daily, and people who bathed daily, sometimes twice. We literally had to teach these plague-carrying invaders how to wash their asses. And then Mr. Trump University says we lived in tents. Tents? Our cities had towering architecture and stone temples that dwarfed anything in Europe during that time, in the Americas and in Africa. And since you mentioned Africa, Africans were master architects who gave the world mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and engineering. Europe produced the colonizers who stole it all. Europe gave the world genocide, colonization, and syphilis. And some of y'all today still don't bathe.
Man, I'm starting to realize that a lot of us African Americans were done a really big disservice by not being taught about what African people went through in their history and their culture. Because the type of videos that I'm hearing and seeing about you guys complaining about Africans demanding reparations, and you automatically assuming that they're demanding it from the American government, is legitimately asinine. It shows that we were never taught about what Africans went through when it came to the slave trade outside of us. We were never taught about what they went through during World War I, what they went through during World War II, not about apartheid. Because we have that lack of knowledge, we simply walk around not understanding the struggles that they went through as people. When I took it upon myself to educate myself on African history, culture, and what they've gone through as people, I realized that our struggles aren't completely different, and if anything, they're connected. And to take it a step further, as Black people globally, no matter what country or culture you come from as a Black person in the world, we have a lot more to fight for with each other than we do to have to fight against each other. And it is truly sad how a lot of y'all refuse to go and do your research and just learn about African people and their history because they were taught about ours as African Americans. You know about our history, you know about our pain and our struggles. So why don't you know about theirs? And as an older Gen Z, I can see how our lack of knowledge and education on African people and their culture and their history has turned into full-blown ignorance. It's just crazy because information is everywhere. It's literally at the tip of your fingers. As African Americans, we cannot continue to keep hiding behind what we weren't taught. It's on us to learn, it's on us to grow, and to stand with Africa, not against it.
Black men were castrated because they didn't want them to have children with their women. The longest slave trade only ended in the 20th century, ending in 1962. I think in Yemen they said. The Arab slave trade, also sometimes called the Muslim slave trade. However, I just want to give a disclaimer, I love my Muslim people, I love the Ummah. As well as the fact that this doesn't excuse the transatlantic slave trade. The systematic effects, the scale, the demographic, the misplacement or displacement of Black people around the world, racism, colorism, the richness of European countries, the use of racial hierarchies was all introduced due to the transatlantic slave trade. Segregation, all of these things are incomparable evils. But it is good to go through the Arab slave trade and what happened. Now, using the Indian Ocean, the Arabs would take people from East Africa, Central Africa, some parts of Europe to be slaves. Most of those slaves were women. So the men, I already told you what happened to the men, they were made into eunuchs, so they were castrated so they wouldn't have babies with their women, and they were also made to guard their women. But they took majority women, which was the slaves, which was different towards the transatlantic slave trade, because those women, their purpose was to be concubines, and the men to be soldiers or guard their women in harems. Now, I just want to say the Prophet did say you shouldn't, there's no Arab is above no black, like no blacks above an Arab. Like it said to not be racist, but some Muslim people did legalize that and use backing from the religion, just as Christians used it inside the transatlantic slave trade. Now, with Muslims, or the people that enslaved, that said they were Muslims back then, they would just enslave people that they conquered in war that were non-Muslims, which again, in the Quran, it says to be peaceful and to not be like things like that. but it said it ended in 1962. However, in Saudi Arabia right now, there is around 740,000 people that have been, they call it human trafficking now, so they would be in modern day slavery, forced to do housework, things like that, with no means of returning back to their land. Oftentimes they were tricked into trying to look for a better work, and now they are basically servants, slaves. Now, aside from the things I mentioned, more of the things were actually similar to the transatlantic slave trade. Families were separated, people were forced to march in the deserts, obviously the oceans, people, they were dangerous, and people also died. I think in the Indian Ocean that they said they used. And, you know, it's another brutal system that happened to black people. But as I said, when you listen to these videos, you mustn't be sad about this history, because we are still here. The culture, black culture, whether it's Jamaican, African American, is something that people would desperately like to be a part of. So I like to see it as, you know, we are persistent, we are resilient. I'm also not racist. I just want people to know that. I just want to uplift people that haven't been uplifted. Black men were...
So when I talked about chattel slavery initially and focused on the transatlantic slave trade, I saw some of y'all trying to check me. And listen, if you thought I left something out, you're right to speak on it. Because if I'm going to talk about black displacement, I can't leave out how we were trafficked across every direction, not just the Atlantic. But let's be very clear, there were no untruths in what I said. What I shared was one part of a much bigger system. So today I'm going to break down the other part, one they rarely talk about, the Arab slave trade. Most of us are taught about the transatlantic slave trade, right? Where European nations kidnapped and enslaved over 12 million Africans and shipped them to the Americas. But long before that started, another massive slave system was already in place, the Arab slave trade. This began around the 7th century, just after the rise of Islam, and it lasted for over 1,200 years. That's twice as long as the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans, estimates say anywhere from 10 to 20 million, were taken from East, Central, and parts of West Africa and sold across North Africa, the Middle East, Persia, the Arabian Peninsula, and even parts of India, Pakistan, and Southeast Asia. And here's the key thing. This wasn't one single trade route. It was a whole network made up of two major routes that we're going to break down next. So we're going to talk about the trans-Saharan slave trade, which is just the first part of the Arab system. The trans-Saharan slave trade, it involved moving enslaved people north, across the Sahara Desert, into places like Egypt, Libya, Morocco, and Tunisia. And this was done through caravans, which, if you don't know, included huge groups of camels and traders moving through brutal desert conditions. People walked for hundreds of miles in chains without enough water or food. Thousands died just trying to get to the slave market. So who were the victims? Most were young boys and girls from places like Mali, Niger, Chad, and Sudan. The boys were often castrated and made to serve in royal palaces, harems, and courts. The girls were sold as concubines, house servants, and entertainers. The violence was extreme, but so was the erasure. Most of these people never got the chance to build families. Many never made it out of servitude. And because they were often forced to assimilate, their history was wiped out. No records, no surnames, no lineage left behind. So Route 2, under the Arab system, is the Indian Ocean slave trade, which ran east, not north. This route took people from East Africa, places like Tanzania, Kenya, Mozambique, and Madagascar, and shipped them across the Indian Ocean to the Arabian Peninsula, Iran and Iraq, parts of India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, even Indonesia and southern China. This trade lasted over 1,000 years. And just like the Trans-Saharan route, it focused on black labor, sexual exploitation, and military service. In India and Pakistan, enslaved Africans became soldiers, guards, palace staff, or enslaved women for royal households. Many of their descendants are actually still there today, but they're often marginalized and forgotten. So why don't we hear about this as much as we hear about the transatlantic? One word: erasure. Many enslaved men were castrated, so they couldn't have families. Others were absorbed into Arab and Asian societies, renamed, converted, and stripped of all identity. There was no diaspora like we see in the Americas, because so many people were intentionally erased. And because Arab and Muslim societies never really publicly confronted their role in slavery, there's no global reckoning, no memorials, no documentaries, no widespread education, just silence. So yeah, I focused on the transatlantic slave trade in my last video, because that's our direct link, especially here in the Americas. But if we're talking about black displacement and stolen lives, We do have to talk about all of it. The Arab slave trade, the Trans-Saharan route, the Indian Ocean route. 3 names, 1 system, 1 long history of Black people being stolen, used, erased, and never properly accounted for. So we honor them, even the ones we don't know, because we're not just survivors of one trade. We're survivors of every direction they dragged us. And the world still owes all of us answers.
This video is for the Muslims and for Africans. And I hope that if you watch this video that you will please share it to help me share this message. As somebody who speaks a lot about African issues, African history, African economics, I can't do that and I can't be sincere to that mission unless I address this topic. The Arab slave trade lasted for over 1,000 years. And in that time, millions of men, women and children were taken from their homes. They were sold across North Africa, the Middle East, and even some parts of Asia. Some experts say that anywhere between 10 to 18 million Africans were taken through these trade routes, and that number could be even higher if you include the slaves that were traded within Africa. Life, of course, was extremely hard for these people. Men were often castrated, which means that they were made unable to have children of their own. Women were often forced into becoming servants or concubines or wives against their will. Others became soldiers, and others still were forced to work on salt mines and on farms or plantations until they died. Families were not only broken apart, but entire generations were wiped out. And who benefited from this the most? The sultans, the rulers, and the traders. These were people who lived in massive palaces, who wore the most expensive clothes, who ate on golden platters, and who had servants around them 24/7. They were the elite of the elite, the 1%, if you will. They did this because it helped keep them in a state of wealth. It helped maintain their empires. It kept them in control and in power. And when people questioned them about it, they said that Islam allowed this. The question is, was that Islam? Is that what Islam taught? And to answer that, we have to go back to the Prophet of Islam himself, peace be upon him, how he lived, what he said, what he did. There's a very famous story of when the Quraysh, the leaders of the Quraysh, the Arab pagans, the idol worshippers in Mecca, offered to him and said, we will give you power, we will give you money, we will give you status, and we will give you women if you will just
Speaking of the Arab slave trade.
Yes, sir. Yes,
okay,
sir.
okay, without question. Now, the difference between the Arab slave trade and the European slave trade is the Arab slave trade never ended. The Arab slave trade is going on right now, and I would personally fault many African American Sunni Orthodox Muslim leaders for hiding the Arab slave trade under the umbrella of their religion. One of the reasons I left the masjid, because I was raised Muslim, Sunni Orthodox Islam, one of the reasons I had to abdicate from the masjid is there was too much cultural imitation going on. I'm not an Arab, and black people didn't leave the white man's Christianity to go to the Arabs' Islam. Now, Muhammad ibn Abdullah was a blue, black, purple man, just like Jesus, son of Joseph and Mary. You understand? So we don't have to imitate Arabs. But when you don't know who you are, you automatically pick up somebody else's culture. And every religion was incubated in a culture. So Islam was incubated in Arab culture. Although the Arabs of that day were black men who evolved into pale and yellow, still we sucked up the culture more than the religion. And there's a hadith from the Prophet Muhammad who said, give them religion, don't take away their culture. Because he understood that my 23 years of being a prophet cannot compare to 200,000+ years of African culture.
Oh, yeah.
Muhammad was only with you 23 years. Jesus was with you 3. So I'm going to throw out hundreds of thousands of years of African culture for 3 years of Jesus and 23 years of Muhammad. I got to be insane. And my problem with the Muslim brothers and sisters who I love, I'll still go to the masjid and pray. I love them, but I cannot tolerate the Arab cultural imitation. Okay? There's no such thing as Muslim food. Show me Muslim food in the Quran. The Quran does not mention anything about no Muslim food. That's Arab food. See? And you're taking Arab culture and you're putting it in your religion and you're making it divine. And that's why I agree with Dr. Yusuf bin Yaqin, Garveyite scholar, ancestor now, grandmaster teacher, when he said, religion is the deification of culture. Religion is the deification of culture. When Leonardo da Vinci painted The Last Supper in 1482, 10 years before Columbus, that white Jesus still with us now. Still in the black church now. That white Jesus, that pale skin, blue-eyed, blonde hair, deified white people in the minds of Africans. It has deified us so much that most black churches will never get rid of that white Jesus, even though they know Jesus wasn't white. I spoke in Fort Lauderdale a couple years ago. There was a fundraiser for the Marcus Garvey Technical School in Kingston, Jamaica. I believe it's in Kingston. But the Marcus Garvey Technical School of Jamaica had a fundraiser and I keynoted, right? I met a brother there from Jamaica. He said, Dr. Umar, let me tell you a story. True story. He said, I belong to a church in Jamaica that has a white Jesus. He said, I went out and got a black artist to paint the most beautiful black Christ you can ever see in your life. I told the pastor, we got a black Jesus now. You can get rid of that. And the black pastor in Jamaica told him that painting will never be hung in here. This is the Jesus that we will serve. When your enemy becomes your deity, when your deity and your enemy are one in the same and you are comfortable with that, you deserve to be a slave.
Yeah.
You deserve to be a slave. I will never worship God in the image of another people. And the irony of it is every religious teacher in ancient time came in our skin. Buddha looked like me. Krishna looked like me. Moses, Muhammad, Jesus, they was all black, but we are so comfortable and content worshiping him in the image of our oppressor. And if you say Jesus should be black, are you speaking of the Arab slave?
The Arab slave trade lasted more than 13th century, 3 times longer than transatlantic trade that most people know. Yet for something that shapes so many lives across Africa and Asia, it is rarely discussed in classrooms, museums, or public conversations. When you mention it, people often change the subject. Some call it a myth, others say it's a distraction from European colonial history. But the truth is, both trades happened. Both were brutal and both deserve honest discussion. The first recorded slave markets under early Arab rule appeared in the 7th century, not long after Islam began spreading across the Arabian Peninsula. Traders crossed the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, moving through places like the Swahili Coast, the Horn of Africa, and deep into Central Africa. They carried ivory, gold, and spice, and people. Young boys, girls, and men were taken from modern Tanzania, Mozambique, Sudan, and Ethiopia. Caravans stretched across the desert for weeks. The journey themselves killed many before they even reached ports like Zimba, Muscat, or Basra. The difference between the Arab trade and the transatlantic one was partly in purpose. In the Americans, the system was built on plantation labor. Enslaved Africans were meant to reproduce and create generations of workers. In the Arab world, most men were castrated. They could not have families. Women were taken for domestic service or concubinage. A young huge number died during transport because of dehydration, infection, or exhaustion. Those who survived often ended up far from their homelands in Persia, Arabia, India, or the island of the Indian Ocean. When historians estimate the scale, it's hard to find precise numbers, but credible studies suggest that between 10 and 8 million Africans were enslaved through Arab networks. The real figure could be higher because record keeping was inconsistent and much of the trade happened long before Europeans began documenting global slavery. What makes this history even darker is that it lasted until 20th century. Official abolition in Saudi Arabia didn't come until 1962. Yemen and Oman ended slavery around the same time. Even after that, practices of debt bondage and forced domestic labor continued under new names. So why don't we talk about this? Part of the reasons is cultural and political sensitivity. Some of the regions involved are still shaped by the same regional and cultural ties that existed centuries ago. Criticizing the trade can feel like criticizing Islam itself, which would be inaccurate and unfair. The faith founding text speak of equality. No Arab is above a non-Arab, no white above a black. But the people of power often twist religion to justify exploitation. The same thing happened in Europe. Christianity was used to defend transatlantic trade. People use ideology to sanitize Christianity. That is the pattern. Another reason this history stays buried is academic selectivity. Western institutions built their moral authority around condemning transatlantic trade. It allows a simple narrative: Europe as colonizer, Africa as victims, the Arab world somewhere in between. But if the Arab trade is studied equally, the picture becomes more complicated. It shows that African suffering was global and continuous, not confined to one region or one religion. It also challenges modern African elites who have strong economic or cultural ties with the Middle East. Some historians like T. Jan, Nidia, or Senegal argue that this silence protects those relationships. But historical truth isn't about comfort, it's about competenciness. The silence leaves these huge gaps in African self-understanding. For example, if trace the populations around the Indian Ocean, in Oman, the UAE, Iran, and South Asia, you will find communities with clear African ancestry. Many of them are descendants of those enslaved. Yet socially they are almost invisible. In some places they are called Zaj, a word that originally meant black, but now carries centuries of stigma. Their presence proves the trade happened, but their erasure shows how deeply society prefer to forget. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, African Americans rarely learn about this side of history either. Our education system taught slavery only as European American phenomenon. That framing isolates black history within a Western context. It leaves many African Americans unaware of the parallel experiences that Africans endure under Arab control, or of how the two systems shape migration, religion, and culture across the continent. That ignorance breeds division. Some people in the diaspora see Africans as outsiders who sold them out. Some Africans see African Americans as disconnected and arrogant. Both views come from incomplete education. When we start to connect the dots, we realize that the global black experience from the Niger Delta to Bahia, from Zanzibar to Harlem, is a single continuous story of displacement, survival, and reinvention. The trades were different in methods but identical in effect. They broke families, languages, and identities. They created a world where blackness became associated with servitude and whiteness or Arabness with power. That social coding still shapes economics and attitude today. Consider the gender impact because men were often killed or castrated. African genetic influence in the Middle East became matrilineal. In other words, you can see African DNA in many model Arab populations, but not visibly in skin tone because of the centuries of mixing and selective marriage. The absence of self-identified black Arabs isn't biological, it's cultural erasure. Children born to African mothers and Arab fathers were often absorbed into the father's lineage, with blackness quietly rewritten out of the record. This makes the question, where are the black Arabs today? Both literally symbolic, they exist in southern Iran, Oman, Kuwait, and the Comoros, but their stories are marginalized. In places like Basra, Afro-Iran still face discrimination. Many don't even have official recognition as a minority group. The same is true in parts of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, where descendants of African slaves still do low-status work, often under kafala systems that critics describe as model-day slavery. The forms have changed, but the heritage remains. Now, when we bring up this history, some people feel accused or defensive. That is not the point. The goal is understanding. Every civilization at some stage has participated in exploitation. The lesson is not to distribute blame by race or religion, but to confront how easily human beings justify cruelty when profit and power are at stake. For Africans and people of African descent, this understanding is crucial because it restores agency. It shows that our suffering was not an isolated accident of European colonization, but part of a long global pattern of dehumanization. The resilience of African peoples after such a history is almost miraculous. Despite centuries of being traded, displaced, and silenced, African culture survived. In language, music, food, and spirituality, you can hear the echoes of East Africa in the rhythms of the Indian Ocean Island, the voices of West African and American gospel and Caribbean drums. These connections are proof that oppression can break bodies but not memory. Let's also look at how this forgotten trade shaped religion in Africa. Islam spread through many parts of the continent along the same trade routines. Some conversations were volunteer, others influenced by power and structures. Over time, Islam became an African religion too, indigenized and reshaped by local cultures. That is why you will find African Muslims today who embrace their faith while openly acknowledging the painful chapter of its historical spread. They separate divine principles from human wrongdoing. That is maturity, something every culture needs to do with its own history. Model scholars are beginning to address this more openly. Archaeological work in coastal East Africa reveals ruins of slave markets and routines that connect inland regions to the sea. Oral histories in Tanzania, Sudan, and Ethiopia preserve memories of raids, resistance, and intermarriage. Writers like Silva Doe and Paul Lovejoy have documented how enslaved Africans contributed to Middle East economies, built cities, and influenced music and cuisine. These stories bordered what we mean by African diaspora. It's not just the transatlantic world, it's also the Indian Ocean world. Still, public awareness lacks. There are few documentaries, few school lessons, and even fewer monumentals. Compare that to how the Atlantic slave trade is commemorated with museums in Liverpool, Ghana, and the United States. The imbalance affects how Africans and African descendants see themselves. It creates this illusion that some histories are worth remembering and others are not. That imbalance must end if we want genuine Pan-African unity. And this brings me to another point: how misinformation divides black people globally. Online, we see arguments between African Americans, Africans, and Caribbeans about who suffered more or who deserved reparations. Those arguments are pointless if we don't know the full scope of what happened. Africans suffered under both Arab and European systems. The diaspora suffered under colonialism and racial segregation. None of these experiences cancelled each other out. They are chapters of what the same book. Our power lies in reading it together. As a modern generation, especially those of us with access to information, we have no excuse to remain ignorant. The archive exists, the data exists, the testimonials exist. If you care about justice, you have to care about accuracy. Learning about the Arab slave trade doesn't diminish the fight for African American reparations. It enriches it. It shows that anti-blackness is a global construct that must be dismantled globally. It's also worth remembering that while some people perpetuated slavery, others resisted it. In 869 CE, the Saj rebellion broke out in southern Iran, a massive uprising of African slaves against their masters. It lasted nearly 15 years and nearly topped the Abbas Caliphate. That rebellion is one of the earliest recorded mass revolts of enslaved people in history, yet it's barely mentioned in textbooks. Why? Because it disrupts the narrative of massive victims. It shows Africans as the agents of their own liberation centuries before their abolition movements in Europe. Stories like that need to be told more. They shift our focus from trauma to resistance, from despair to pride. They remind us that African history isn't just a record of suffering, it's a record of endurance and genius. From architecture in Mali and Ethiopia to navigation on Swahili coast, African civilization were vibrant long before outsiders arrived. The strategy is that this civilization were exploited, not that they were inferior. If we keep that in mind, discussions about slavery change. They stop being about guilty and start being about growth. We learn to recognize the system, economy, racial, ideological that allowed slavery to exist, and we see their model equivalent. Today, forced labor still exists in various forms, from trafficking to exploitative migrants work. This same logic that turned people into property centuries ago now turns workers into disposable assets. Studying the Arab slave trade is not just about the past, it's about recognizing those continuity. Ultimately, history is not a weapon to shame people, it's a mirror. The Arab trade, the transatlantic trade, European colonialism, all of it shows that happens when greed overrides empathy. For Africans and people of African descent, understanding this full spectrum means reclaiming identity from the margin of other people's story. It means knowing that blackness existed long before slavery and will exist long after its rampant disappear. So when you hear someone say slavery ended centuries ago, remember that for some regions it ended in the lifetime of your grandparents. Remember the 1960s abolition dates. Remember the workers still strive in domestic servitude today. And remember that silence is a choice that allows injustice to repeat itself. Learning, speaking, and connecting, that is how we break that silence.
And if you have watched up to this extent, thank you so much for all the love and support. Don't forget to please leave me your own thought in the comment section of what you think of this video. And please do not forget that we do not support any form of bullying and harassment. Alright, lovely. See you when I upload the next video.